my pleasure to facilitate the group this afternoon that is talking about new land stewards. And so first off, I want to thank the Witte Museum and just the leadership that they've taken over the last several years in land stewardship and things like their Land Stewardship Ambassadors program. I know Helen Holdsworth is sitting here who works closely with us on that and basically helping develop the future of land stewards so that when we look around at those people that are here 20 years from now, we've got people that really still care about the state of Texas and care about the private lands that we have that are really important. So in Texas, we've got a little over 500,000 people a year moving into the state legally. And that has caused an increase in our population. By the end of the year, like you heard from Joni Carswell earlier today, we're likely to have 30 million people. And with the 9th largest economy in the nation, you have to wonder what's the backbone of that economy. And so the hidden backbone of the economy in the state of Texas is that 140 some odd million acres of farms, ranches, and forest lands, and all of the economic prosperity that those lands provide, but also just the quality of life and the future that those lands provide for the state really do end up being the fabric that is driving our state's prosperity. And we just got to figure out how to keep from loving it to death. So the two people that we have presenting today, Roel Lopez. Roel Lopez is a director of the Natural Resources Institute at Texas A&M. He's also the new department head of a new department there, the Range, Wildlife, and Fisheries Management Department. And he's got a pretty heavy resume. You can read a little bit about him in the program. I'll let you do that instead of introducing all of his accolades. The second presenter is Jenny Sanders. Jenny is a conservationist, a wildlife biologist, and she also works with the Natural Resources Institute. She has done work in looking at the reasons and rationale behind people's conservation ethic and what drives people, particularly private landowners. She'll probably clean up after me and explain that in a different way. Both of these people are lifelong conservationists, lifelong Texans. They know and understand private lands in a level of detail from a statewide perspective better than most people, and maybe better than any. So I will hand things over to Roel Lopez, and then we'll hand it over to Jenny Sanders after Roel is done.
All right, thank you, Neal. And there's a clicker up here. Yeah, there it is. All right. So thank you for that introduction. And I like crowds like this because it can be more of a conversation. The charge that was given to me this morning is to talk about some of the challenges that we're facing in our state with regards to natural resources, the management, the stewardship, and sustainability of those. And I used this slide earlier, a couple of weeks ago, in talking to a large group that was interested in the conservation of natural resources at a global scale. And when you look at some of the grand challenges that we're facing as a society at a global level, things from changing climate, wildfires, large changes in land cover, deforestation, impacts to wildlife populations and their habitat, environmental pollution, and of course, impacts to our water supply. These are all, again, significant challenges, but one of the things that I shared with them was this photo, and I asked the question, if we have that interest, we don't have to go very far from our doorstep. We could just walk outside the door and look at some of these more local, in our backyard challenges. And this is a lonely cowboy here. How many people recognize the landscape there? 75 years ago, we got one or two. We're in Dallas. So just outside of Dallas, maybe where McKinney, Texas might be and so forth. And I want you to remember that for a little later. And some of those landmarks include the Magnolia Hotel, the two power towers from the electric power company there. And so again, it's kind of amazing to see what 75 years ago looked like in Dallas, Fort Worth, Texas. San Antonio, Austin, etc. are seeing some of those same changes. And so one of the things I want to convey to you today is the fact that we don't have to go very far to see the impacts to our environment. Look at, for example, North American grasslands. It's the most at-risk and least protected biome on planet Earth. Native grasslands, we're losing at a fairly significant rate, about 2 million acres annually within the North America region. So this is tallgrass prairie. And again, this is equivalent to what we see in clearing in terms of the Brazilian Amazon forest, or an area about the size of Yellowstone National Park. So every year we're losing that in terms of native grasslands, native rangelands. In Texas, historically, there are about 20 million acres of tallgrass prairie. Less than 1% of this remnant ecosystem remains. We don't have to go very far to see some of the impacts that we're seeing in our state. Neal alluded to some of those changes that are occurring, in many cases, very rapidly, and so forth. So we have an opportunity, I think, for us to try to conserve these last remnants of this important ecosystem. And I'm going to talk about the value of rangeland, the value of prairie. It goes well beyond just, cattle and so forth. That's an important value, but there's other goods and services that stem from that. And again, these changes are happening here. So Texas is a large state. I want to put it in a context so then Jenny could talk about landowners. 171 million acres, 83% of our state is a farm, a ranch, a family forest. 141 million acres, 83%. And we currently support about 30 million Texans and growing, 30 million Texans. Almost 90% of Texans live in an urban center. About 10% live in a rural community, and 1% of Texans own 83% of the land base. That's Aggie math, 101%, right? So again, the importance of land stewards is extremely important to all of us. I live in Bexar County, and I recognize that the value of water from my tap comes from a farm or ranch upstream. And so this is why this is so important, and why the conservation of rural land, working lands, farms and ranches is so important. This is a phrase from Blair Fitzsimmons. I give her credit for the notion of land is infrastructure. So when you think of infrastructure, you may think of roads and water systems and so forth, but land, rural land, is infrastructure. And it provides all these goods and services to all of us. And the situation is we're losing about a section of land every day. By the end of today, we would have lost a square mile of a farm or ranch. And you don't have to go very far before you lose that 141 million acres, right? That, coupled with the fact that most of our landowners are approaching retirement age. So by our estimates, we estimate about a third of these farms and ranches will be impacted right now, in the next 5 years, 10 years, etc. This is happening now. And so what can we do to address this? This is the graph that I use often because it describes this process of we have a strong economy, more population growth. Neal alluded to that. More Californians coming to the state. There's an increase in demand for rural land, followed by an increase in land values, followed by the incentive to fragment and convert. So that's the last step in this process. And so we've been seeing this for the last 20 plus years, and it's only continuing and or accelerating. And so this change in working lands and farms and ranches is so important in the work that we do. And the stewards that are currently part of this equation are also very important. And Jenny's going to talk more to that here in a bit. But I do want to, again, continue to sort of set the stage and make the case, if you will, on demand, conversion, and so forth. The fact is, we've got about 30 million Texans. That number is going to double in the next 20 to 30 years. These are projections that kind of show that by 2050, we'll be about 55 or so million. At the rate we're going, it's probably going to be a little higher than that. We're seeing shifts in urban versus rural Texans. We're seeing shifts in other groups like Hispanics. And so again, if we're trying to promote the conservation, the stewardship of working lands, of farms and ranches, we need to try to do a better job in the engagement of these emerging groups, in my opinion, right? So in the last 20 years, we've seen about a 50% increase in the population. 7 of the top 15 most rapidly growing cities in the nation happen to be in Texas. And they're all associated with those large urban centers, Dallas, Fort Worth, Austin, San Antonio, Houston, and so forth. They call that the Texas Triangle. And we've seen about 86% of that increase in human population associated with those urban anchors, right? And that trend's only going to continue. An early predictor and driver is market value. More people, greater demand, an increase in market value. And looking at market value over the state, this is a statewide average, it's about a 300% increase, okay? In some areas, it's much more significant. I've been following some reports where an acre of land in Travis, Bexar County is running $100,000. It's hard to make a living, or it's hard to retain that sort of development pressure when it's encroaching upon you, right? And so this is part of that challenge. This is McKinney, Texas. Remember that lone cowboy sitting out there? This is what he looked at, or we saw what he was looking at. But in 1981, 96, (2016), increase in demand, breakup of farms and ranches, higher sale value, and again, that's the end result. We lose on average about 2 million acres of working lands or have annually. And one question that I oftentimes like asking people, what's the last crop that we're going to plant in Texas? Asphalt. That's the last crop that we'll plant in Texas. And so what are the consequences of that? We lose a square mile of a farm or ranch every day. What are the consequences of that loss? Well, by our estimates, and you can tell by looking at me, I like steak. We won't be able to generate 20,000 steak dinners annually every day when we lose that square mile of a farm or ranch. The ability to produce fiber, 10,000 blue jeans, are lost. The ability to fill 91 water towers, also lost. So these are some of the goods and services that come from these private lands. And the demand in terms of people and so forth on these resources is pretty monumental. So again, just looking, I like this figure just to kind of give folks a sense of how many straws are going into our ground with a limited resource, right? And so again, this is something that we're trying to address. So I'm going to ask a few basic questions to then turn it over to Jenny here. The first question, in thinking about the issue and thinking about the problem, is this: why value land? Why do we want to value land beyond traditional market value or value from an ag production and so forth? I think part of it, in my mind, is understanding the true value of a farm and ranch in its completeness, in terms of the flood mitigation, in terms of erosion control, in terms of recreational opportunities, in terms of food, fiber, in terms of all these other values, can help us justify and understand what the consequences are of losing a square mile of a farm or ranch every day. That's the problem that we're dealing with now. We're losing this, and we understand just a part of it. We don't really understand the full picture of what this means. And we can't start to promote conservation stewardship until we understand what the true value is of that piece of property, in my opinion. Why value land? That's why. What is the value of land? That's part of the challenge that we're dealing with now. You know, we talk about goods and services, right? There's public benefits that are derived from private lands. I said one earlier. I live in Bexar County. I live here just a couple blocks from here. And I understand that the water that comes out of my tap comes from a farm or ranch upstream, over the aquifer and so forth. But water is just one of a few things. Flood control, carbon sequestration, clean air, clean water, all of these things are the collective goods and services that these private lands offer. And there's a move right now where we're trying to better understand this more complete picture in terms of the economic benefits, the ecological benefits, the societal benefits of all these things, right? And so, again, the term that they often use is goods and services, which are basically what nature provides us for free. I'll say it in a different way. The public benefits from private lands. How can we better value that? And by doing so, then make the case. There's another aspect to that. So it's not just one singular value. There's values like fiber, water quality, water quantity, etc. This is for Midland County, and this is some work that we've been doing for the Institute. We hope to wrap this up here pretty quick. But as a way to illustrate, this is the value of a more complete picture of an acre of land in Midland County. But being able to do that for other areas is I think, part of the equation to again, establish market-based incentive frameworks, to establish other programs that can, again, really show the more complete value of these rural lands, these farms and ranches. And so with that, I want to leave you with a couple of points, and then I'm going to turn it over to Jenny here to talk more about land stewards. I purposely kind of went over that or skipped that so she had some time to drill into that. Land is infrastructure. So I think we need to start to look at things in that way in order for us to start to move the needle in a better direction. We need to look at how can we basically understand the more complete value, and how can we set up frameworks to incentivize private landowners to continue the stewardship of those lands. And lastly, being able to communicate that. You know, in San Antonio a few years ago, they passed a bond where the conservation easements are placed on private lands outside of San Antonio for the protection of the aquifer. And I think it's the third, fourth time in a row that the city of San Antonio has voted positive in support of that. Why? It's cheaper to keep our water clear and clean, where 70% of the water comes from that aquifer, as opposed to some expensive type of treatment and so forth. The water that comes out of the Edwards aquifer is relatively clean. They add a little bit of chlorine, and that's about it. It didn't happen by chance. It happened by the fact that you've got a farm and ranch that is stewarded in a way that acts like a sponge that serves to clean that water, that injects that water into our aquifers, into our streams, into our rivers, and so forth. And so, to me, that's part of our conversation today. Next slide. I think that's my last one. And with that, Jenny's going to tell us more about the stewardship, or stewards.
Thank you. Yeah, so what I'm going to talk to you about, Roel got to give you the gloom and doom. I get to tell you the fun, good part about the opportunities that I think are out there for this great land as infrastructure, and how we can incentivize and who the people are that are actually stewarding that land. Going into a bit of a new era, as Roel touched on. Let me see if I can hit the right button here. But landowners are changing. He talked about the fact that we're going to be seeing a change, generational transfer of land in the coming years. We're already seeing some of that. And I think a lot of what we do is talking to, a lot of what I'm doing lately is talking to new biologists, new agency personnel about the fact that we sometimes have this historical stereotype about what a Texas landowner is, who that person is. Is it this guy on a horse herding sheep, herding cattle? And is that representative of the predominant Texas landowner now? Yes, those guys still exist. But can all of our programs be tailored to that historical view of a Texas landowner? Are they still going to be effective when we start looking at who that new landowner is. And so we've been looking at this for a number of years. So again, we know through some of the work that they do at NRI that the average farmer's pushing 60, average forest landowner is even a little older than that. So what does that mean? That land's not going to be in their control that much longer. So what do we know about the future Texas landowner? Theoretically, they're not as tied to the land, perhaps. Since daddy's been, or grandpa or grandma has been running the land many times, this younger generation went into the city, they got a different job, and maybe they're coming back to the land, but what are their goals and objectives? And are those the same? Are their concerns the same? What is their tie to the land? We're seeing more absentee ownership, but the landowner survey that's done every 5 years by NRI kind of gives us some of those answers. All of this data will go up to 2017. They just wrapped up the newest version of that survey, and it'll be coming out soon, but that's why some of this data might seem a little old. But when we start looking at those folks and what motivates them, who would have thought that these would be the top motivating factors for land ownership just 15, 20 years ago? And when I talk to folks that are making policy in regards to agriculture and wildlife, I think a lot of folks still are stuck in the idea that this making a living, oil and gas, that those and even investment are the driving factors for decisions on and reasons for owning land. And the reality is, many of the landowners that I talk to now, these are the reasons that they own land. They want to get out of the city. They want to recreate on their land. They want that family legacy. And the wildlife and conservation are ranking much higher than you would have thought just not too many years ago. Again, looking at wildlife valuation from 1997 to 2017, it's just a steady increase in people that are doing their 1D1 tax valuation with wildlife in mind as opposed to agriculture. And again, looking at that, just a few hill country counties to where wildlife valuation is being more and more common throughout the state, most of the state. Again, looking at income, hunting's up there, oil and gas is up there, but look how many of these folks, are not making any income off of their land. So that's something of interest. If you're looking at designing programs that would incentivize conservation, obviously, if somebody is focused on income production, it might be a little bit harder to, or it might be a different conversation than if they're not even making income off of their land. This is a recreational property. Just think about that, what that conversation might look like. Are you interested in selling your land in the next few years? And this breaks out millennials versus others, just to look at kind of that newer generation. But it's good news. There's a good chunk of them that aren't planning to sell anytime soon. I like seeing that number. And then this is interesting. Obviously, it illustrates that upcoming trend in land transfer. If you look at the millennials, they're not at all likely to transfer their land in the next 10 years, but that other group is much more likely to. So you can see kind of the writing on the wall about what's fixing to happen here. Okay, so let's look at what is the difference, what's changing in the landowner community. And this goes back to a study we did in 2004 where we developed a framework that I've used ever since that time. And most recently on a project that we're working on, a book project looking at the art and science of private land stewardship. We actually did a national analysis of this framework, comparing it to other studies that have looked at landowners and trying to divide landowners out to see if there are predictive factors, ways we can talk to them in a way that will appeal to them most effectively. And this framework plays out throughout all of those studies that we looked at nationwide. So what we did in 2004 is we took a series of 4 counties on kind of a gradient from urban to rural, and where we could see trends in land ownership sizes. and where we predicted that in those, so Bell County is a much more urban county. The property sizes are fairly small in comparison, and it goes up in a gradient to Comanche County being much more rural and property sizes being quite a bit larger. We also predicted that we would find more traditional agriculture up here and more properties that were doing more non-traditional uses, recreation, wildlife enterprises, stuff like that. And what we wanted to do is see if we could interview these people and if we could find predictive categories based on these demographic or property characteristics that could tell us, hey, these people are going to be in this particular category, are going to be much more likely to participate in various types of programs that would encourage conservation. And specifically, we were looking at endangered species. I won't go into the details of that, but just this is the genesis of this framework that we came up with. So what we did is we identified 4 profile groups. And I was, in a big group, I like to ask people, if you're a landowner, just looking at that, can you, I know Bob McCann knows where he would fit, but we find that this is, describing these groups of landowners in this way makes sense to people. Are you born to the land? Are you reborn to the land? Are you that person that left the farm, had a career in the city or elsewhere, and then came back to take over after parents or grandparents passed on or weren't able to run the ranch anymore? And then ag business landowners. But I'll describe these and then get into why we think this is important. So what we call born to the land, these are the folks that have been on the land their entire life. They've traditionally in agricultural production, more traditional agricultural production throughout their livelihood, their life, and that really supports their livelihood. This is their primary source of income in most cases. Any wildlife enterprises in place on these properties are generally secondary in nature. Maybe they have a hunting lease, but probably not doing major wildlife enterprises. But they talk about the land. They talk about how they physically feel connected to the land. This is a quote, "All I hope is that my grandkids have a high respect for the land. The good Lord says you're a steward of the land, and I believe you have the responsibility to do what's right for it." And this is repeated all the time. It's that spiritual connection. It's that true responsibility that it is my job to take care of this land for future generations. They value independence, hard work, generational knowledge, experiences, and that's what guides how they make their decisions. They tend to have fairly long tenure, generations in some cases, on the land, and larger properties, relatively speaking, depending on what part of the state they're in. So this is what we call reborn to the land. They also have a very strong connection to the land, but it's a little different. We find that it's more of a romantic connection, if you will, as opposed to that strong spiritual connection. This guy talked about how he'd been around the world and had just realized that having a piece of land was such a gift. But look at this word here. I want to make it healthy. This is something that's unique to this group, where they're looking at the land and maybe looking at regenerating. And in the work I'm doing in East Texas, we're doing longleaf pine restoration. Joni Carswell mentioned it this morning. I find that a lot of the people that participate in our program are interested in the legacy value. They want to make this land look like it did when my grandpa was here. When my ancestors came to East Texas, I know that's what it looked like. That's what I want to do. So it's just a little bit different outlook, if you will. They're much more interested in aesthetics. Again, I want it to look the way I saw it looking in the past. Recreation is important. In general, with this group, ag and wildlife operations are more for personal satisfaction. A lot of these folks do need to make some money from their ranch, but they generally have other outside income, either retirement income or jobs off farm that they are getting revenue from. And they say, it's not the money that inspires me to keep doing this. And in general, that's probably a sentiment that most landowner groups would repeat. Yeah, I don't know why. It's just part of our heritage. It's emotional. It's definitely not economics, why I keep the land. But we like this, the enjoyment, like working outside. This is a key here. They recognize their limited knowledge. These are the folks that are buying up smaller farms and ranches that we look at sometimes and we go, that's being fragmented. Oh no. But here's the silver lining. They recognize their limited knowledge and they're seeking that knowledge. And for agencies like NRI, like NRCS, like Extension, that is great news because we need to be the first ones to get to these folks. They want to take care of the land. Stewardship is important, and they really want to learn. Relatively speaking, again, a lot of times these folks have shorter tenure on the land and somewhat smaller properties, but I don't know that that's always the case, especially when you start looking outside of maybe the Central Texas area. And this is an interesting one. This is one we kind of didn't see coming, is these landowners that didn't really fit in one of those categories. I'd say, well, they came back to the ranch or they bought land, it wasn't in their family, but they don't really seem to have that connection to the land, that stewardship connection. So we call them ag business. And what we found is that their connection was to the operation of the ranch, not necessarily the piece of geography that the ranch sat on. They're much more interested in developing those operations that are maybe cutting edge. You know, these are the grass-fed beef folks that might not be a good example anymore because that's becoming so much more. But the cutting edge industry type folks that, you know, they want to put wind turbines on their land. And whereas ag and wildlife was a source of income for the first group, it was a source of enjoyment for the second group, it's more of a source of pride for this group. They're the ones that say, I want to prove that you can make money off of this land and I'm going to show everybody how you do it. So this group is a bit of a challenge when it comes to stewardship because it's a different conversation you've got to have with them. You've got to prove the economics of whatever you're trying to sell. In most cases, they're not as likely to care about legacy as much or about ecosystems or biodiversity, whereas those other groups might. They tend to have a high off-farm income, so that's the opportunity, is that they do have income. And if you can push something to them as this is something innovative, this is something exciting, maybe you'll get some recognition for it. That's how you might get to these folks and kind of appeal to their ethos, if you will. They kind of fall in the middle as far as size and tenure. So all of that being said, we kind of look at these words that make up. One other group that we've kind of identified in our national outlook has been this owner who's more of just an asset owner. Maybe they're an owner that has a piece of land out in Midland that they get royalties off of, but they don't ever go out there. They don't really do anything with it. And that is something, those are going to be the hardest ones to reach, obviously, from a conservation perspective. But we find that this framework of looking at these values that motivate these folks really helps in encouraging both developing conservation programs and encouraging individual landowners to participate in some of those programs. So when we look out, and again, I said this is the silver lining, this is the opportunity we have in the changes that we're seeing in land ownership, is that for Born to the Land folks, we've got to focus on locally delivered programs. They have relationships with local folks, and so those cost share programs that can empower them to be the steward that they want to do, or to do the things on the land that they want to do, are going to be the most effective. And we've got to appeal to that ethical attitude of stewardship. Wildlife is always going to be secondary, or in general going to be secondary for these folks. And so their appeal is more in the pocketbook and less in the romantic idea of conservation and stewardship. And very important that any programs not be too intrusive. These are the low-hanging fruit. And again, this is where I say a lot of times in the conservation community and in the land and agricultural community, we look at these new folks coming in and buying up all this land as a negative. And it is a challenge for sure, but it's also, I see, a very big opportunity for us, and I think a growing opportunity, obviously, because they're easy to get to with programs and conservation efforts because they want to learn. They're seeking expertise and assistance, and that knowledge, and they also have some of the, in a lot of cases, the money to put that knowledge into practice. The ag business folks, I said, sometimes are going to be harder to reach in some ways, but if we can make that economic argument and make this be something that appeals to their pride in their operation, in their business, then in talking about things being bigger and better and unique. And again, these are the folks that I say they have a frontier hero mentality. It's they want to be the one that proves that they can make this work when no one else could. And so appealing to that mentality is going to be most effective. So again, I have an optimistic view of the trends. I like to go back. We were talking about this. We've been talking about this for a long time. In 2004, we did the original study looking at the different profile groups. In 2017, we had a private land summit talking about these trends at TWA. And at that time, we kind of made this pact that we're not going to be concerned. We're going to thrive in these changes. We're not going to wallow in the fact that all these new people are coming in buying up land. But us in the conservation community anyway, we need to be committed to thriving in that change, be a conduit to support those reborn owners that need to make good decisions. And I think a lot of it too is being a resource for the born to the land folks as they look towards those transitions that are going to be happening in their lives and in their land, to hopefully make sure that land gets passed on to someone that's able and willing to really take care of it. And I think that's all I have.
Okay. We're gonna move a couple of chairs up here and ask Roel and Jenny to get an opportunity to air your grievances about their work, or ask questions, put them on the spot, or just have a discussion. And I'll pass around a microphone for whoever wants to. Close together so you can hit each other.
In your demographic analysis, Jenny, in your demographic analysis of different landowners at the very beginning of your presentation, what was the minimum size ownership that you analyzed?
Yeah, so by definition, it's land under 1D or 1D1. So it varies by county, but it's typically 10 acres plus.
In the 2004 study,
I think that was his question.
okay. Yeah, I think it was 50 acres. I think was our because we went by the Texas A&M, it was 50 to 100. We did categories, 50 to 100, 100 to 500, and 500 plus.
That's a great question. I actually don't know the answer to that. We have the data to answer that question. The question is, so we're seeing this transfer of land. Is it an average of 100 acres? Is it a 500 acre tract? Is it a 10,000 acre tract? I actually don't know the answer to that. Thank you. I've never been asked a question I didn't know the answer to, specific to land trends. I had a caveat that. Yeah, go ahead.
Do you still see some of the distinctions in the southern part of the state and in the northern part of the state as far as consolidation versus fragmentation?
Kind of related. So we've seen and continue to see consolidation in certain parts. West Texas is one area, and the other is the Panhandle, where we see actual, bringing together formerly broken up properties. Larger operations. Yep. So various reasons. I have other theories. I think many folks, like in South Texas, maybe during the shell play, sold property or what have you, and landowners like buying land, and so they buy land somewhere else. And West Texas is generally more affordable compared to, let's say, the hill country or what have you. So I think sometimes that happens in certain places or certain people. That's a hypothesis on my part. Yes, sir. I think it's small enough. So just ask your question. I'll repeat it.
In terms of your 4 categories, have you noticed any interesting trends or changes over time in terms of where they tend to be concentrated, whether that's geographically east, west, north, south, and how their attitudes might be changing maybe for non-urbanization reasons, like for instance in the last 20 years the growth of fracking in certain areas, or the growth in solar and wind, and how that affects their views of the land.
Most of my work has been done in the eastern part of the state, well, south and east since the time of that 2004 study. So I haven't had to deal with wind much, and solar doesn't work under trees very good. So, but so no, I guess in my case, I don't know if y'all have any thoughts on that. I do think, and I don't know if this really plays to what you're asking, but I do think we're seeing a lot of just the social trends towards sustainability and non-consumptive uses, and just more of an emphasis on the environment. That plays into how landowners think about their land, especially these newer landowners that are, have been in the city maybe, and now they've bought land or come back to land. They're more aware of their impacts, I guess, maybe. Does that kind of play into what you're asking? Okay.
Yeah, that's the $1 million question, Helen, right? I think, and I'll say what I think about it. I think in some cases, you're never going to be able to do that, because what we're talking about is what's the value of open space and its benefits and so forth from a long-term perspective. And the value from a pure real estate development perspective is, in many cases, always going to be higher. And so I don't think it's a direct comparison. So I think we just need to make the case that there's value to open space, and these are the values, understanding that, developing 100 acres in Travis County, or like the building that they were describing in the previous session or what have you, is going to be much greater return on investment if you're looking at it strictly from a monetary perspective. Does that kind of make sense? So that's the dilemma, and how can you sort of offset that? I just think we have to make a difference in open space versus the land that's developed, just because the latter is just typically going to outstrip that. And Neal, you may have a different perspective.
I was just going to kind of amplify that by asking if you inject into there the things that our state legislature can do, or our state and federal agencies can do to reduce the uncertainty for agricultural production. So for traditional agricultural production, does that have an influence on land fragmentation, land conversion, or that, knowing some of the attitudes of landowners out there, is that going to change the playing field markedly?
If that's a question, I think it would in certain places. But I think that's part of the conversation in my mind with the state legislature and so forth, because you're losing your basic land infrastructure, right? Your base or principle. At some point, you're going to get to the point that you're going to start having other ecological consequences in terms of water recharge and things of that sort. Did I kind of miss your question? Right. I think there's case studies that you could point to with the endangered species and so forth. So if there's greater certainty for managing for certain objectives or what have you, I think you can to provide the framework for landowners to do certain things or maintain things long term.
Organization, I mean, a group that might have some input on that. If there's greater certainty that your profitability over time is going to be is going to be stable, are you more likely or less likely to maintain large ownerships across ranch land? More likely. I mean, that just makes sense, right? And I'm wondering if there's a way that ultimately we could see that in these data, or at least as a community be able to lay that out and connect the type of information that you guys produce there to that thought process. It's, look, these aren't just trends that are happening to us, but there's places where there's land consolidation. And if there's land consolidation on accident, but it's for a reason, what would happen if we did some things to do it on purpose that resulted in, policies that promote consolidation of ownership? If in fact we think consolidation of land ownership is a good thing.
Can I add something? And I don't know the answer to this. So I mentioned that the land trends data comes out every 5 years. So we're scheduled, for those that are landowners, you probably just got your ag census survey and so forth. That's where that information comes from. So the next run of data is coming out here soon. But we look at West Texas and what historically has happened in the last 15, 20 years, right? Consolidation, and it's still pretty rural. But here recently with renewables, solar, wind, et cetera, that's really changing rather dramatically. And some of the work that they're doing out of Sol Ross and Respect Big Bend and so forth is sort of a testament to that. So I think that kind of gives you a test bed for what you're describing, where, what is it if there's greater certainty for maintaining this open space versus you bring in a disruptor of some sort, in this case, energy sprawl. And I'd be curious to see what's happening to some of those properties or transfer of some of those properties in terms of those type of changes, if that makes sense.
We have time for one more question.
Bob?
Well, so I don't know that we have a solid plan yet, but part of what we're doing right now, I'm going around and helping. I'm presenting this, tomorrow, to the Range Wildlife, RWFM, Range Wildlife and Forestry students at A&M. So that's one way to get it out. I'm also going around this year and presenting to all the new NRCS new employee trainings. And then we're actually working on a book project I mentioned called The Art and Science of Private Land Stewardship. And it's actually a national look at private land stewardship, everything from the economic values, the public values of private lands, to this type of stuff, to how do you interact with private landowners and the trends that we're seeing nationwide. and hoping to develop some training programs off of that book as a launch pad. And that was Roel's really good idea.
I don't know about that. So to kind of add to that, the statistics in terms of new professionals is actually kind of eye-opening. About 60 or 70% of students at A&M don't come from a farm and ranch in the College of Ag, which is, again, a pretty high number. And so many agencies are recognizing the lack of background with private land stewardship. And so about 2 weeks ago, I gave a presentation to all of the new Texas Parks and Wildlife biologists, actually with the new data from the land survey, just to, again, make them aware of that so they can factor that into their programming and outreach and so forth. So I think that's where that kind of information can be helpful in developing programs that target these various groups, but understanding those differences in those groups, because there are going to be different programs based on their needs, experience, and things of that sort. Which, by the way, on the landowner survey data that Jenny was presenting, interestingly, the numbers haven't changed. So the top 3 reasons are still the top 3 reasons. I think ranching moved up 1, Bob, but for the most part, it looks just like what it looked like 5 years ago. That's good. Well, when's yeah. Ask Neal. Neal? Well, thank you for coming.